So, welcome all. The numbers of participants was rolling up as fast as U.S. national debt or inflation in France, I suppose. So today we have a paper by a threesome, by a troika, by Brian Kutzinger, Joshua Inger, and Louis Rouault on the inflation in revolutionary France, where I suppose they're going to revise us in some way. But to get it off to a good start, I thought I would have it show a visual aid to show you what a hyperinflation looks like. Is a planche d'assignats, an uncut sheet of assignats. In fact, it was going so fast, the inflation was so fast, they didn't have time to cut them apart, so forth. So still used to be able to find things like this in Paris decades ago. But anyway, these are, as they say, assignats are death, because on the assignats they have on the side it says la loi punit de mort les contrefacteurs, and on the other side it says la nation récompense les dénonciateurs. So take it away, gentlemen. Denounce those who fail to live up. All right, take the floor.
All right, thank you so much, Gene, for that introduction. Let me make sure I share my screen here. Okay. All right, well, thank you so much for having us. My name is Brian Kutzinger. I'm a professor of economics at Angelo State and Texas Tech University, and we're going to be presenting our paper today, Assignats or Death, Inflationary Finance in Revolutionary France. And this is a paper that's co-authored with Josh Ingber and Louis Rouault. Josh is at Northern Michigan University, and Louis is a PhD candidate at George Mason University. Historically, I don't know that I have to tell anybody on the call this, historically governments have relied on money creation to raise revenue. And this is especially so during periods of political instability. Now, one of the interesting things, in my view, about the Assignats episode is that it is the first modern case of hyperinflation. In fact, it's the only case of modern hyperinflation to occur prior to the discretionary fiat standards in the 20th century. Now, it's very common to use hyperinflation to study inflationary finance. In a modern sense, Philip Kagan was the first to start off this research, and he applied his framework to cases of hyperinflation in the 20th century, particularly during the interwar period. And that approach has been extended to analyze a variety of different hyperinflations that have occurred since then. However, there's been little work, not no work, but little work incorporating the rules of the game into our analysis of inflationary finance. And so the question that we're trying to answer in this paper is, how do these rules affect the inflationary tax rate and tax base? And we think the Assignat hyperinflation can help answer this question. And the reason is that there was actually a constitutional reform in the midst of the hyperinflation, and that this reform addressed some of the public finance issues that were responsible for the government's reliance on seigniorage revenue in the first place. Now, a quick overview, and I'll go into more detail in this as we move on. But the big idea that comes out of Kagan's approach to hyperinflation is that there's a limit to how much revenue the government can raise by printing money, and this in the literature typically occurs where the demand for real balances is unit elastic. And the simplest way to think about this, if you're not familiar with this model, is that we have a tax base and we have a tax rate. The tax base is the quantity of real balances that the public decides to hold, and the tax rate is the inflation rate selected by the monetary authorities. Now, of course, the base is not going to be independent of the rules of the game. This is something we know from other areas of public finance, but this idea has not been applied quite as much to the study of inflationary finance. And the base, we're going to argue, depends ultimately on the government's credibility. This is not all that dissimilar from the literature on, say, time and consistency and whatnot, which is that if the public don't regard the government's commitment to printing some quantity of money that's whether it's constant or whatever the announced rate is going to be, if the public doesn't think that's credible, then this opens the door for the government to engage in surprise inflation. If the public know that the government can engage in surprise inflation, then that's going to change the quantity of real balances that they hold. So the rules of the game are going to determine the base, because the rules of the game influence the extent to which the public regards the government as credible. Now, we're going to argue and hopefully show what you guys consider to be convincing evidence that neglecting regime change is going to lead to biased estimates of the demand for money. And this is especially so during periods of political instability. And the idea here is pretty straightforward, is that if we go and look at cases of hyperinflation, and the Assignat hyperinflation is no exception to this, they're typically accompanied by periods of political instability. Political instability is ultimately the result of weak institutions or poorly defined rules. So if we're going to study inflationary finance during periods of hyperinflation, our analysis, we think, needs to incorporate the potential effects of political instability on the demand for money. So while the paper is certainly about looking at this historical episode, we think we can actually learn more lessons than just more lessons that apply to the study of hyperinflation generally than just studying the case of the Assignat hyperinflation. So quick preview of our findings. What we do find is that there is a structural break in the relationship between real balances and inflation. This break occurs or corresponds around the same time as the establishment of the directorial regime in November 1795. We are going to argue that the new regime weakened the relationship between real balances and inflation. And we think that that's likely the result of expected demonetization of the Assignat. We also find that if you neglect to account for the change in the regime, that you're going to get biased estimates of the demand for money. And those biased estimates of the demand for money are going to lead to misleading estimates of the revenue maximizing inflation rate. Okay, so quick overview of the historical context of what's going on here. So we end up having the government's reliance on inflation triggered by fiscal factors, which of course is true of the revolution as well. The government did try to implement a number of fiscal reforms, which included adopting different types of taxes, but none of them were sufficient to cover the outlays. And so the government found itself gripped by an unpleasant fiscal arithmetic. In other words, they were on the wrong side of the bond finance Laffer curve. And in 1789, Jacques Necker, in front of the assembly, says new loans can only increase the current deficit. So we're in a situation where trying to raise money through taxes is not going to be is not adequate. Raising money by issuing bonds is also not going to be accurate. We know that when that sort of situation happens, something else has to give, and that typically results in hyperinflation. So to address this, the National Assembly issues a new paper money called the Assignat. And the idea originally was that the Assignat would be used for auctions to purchase clergy property that the government had essentially expropriated from the clergy to help them remain solvent. Now, in order to pin down the public's inflation expectations, the Assembly promised to shrink the money supply in the future. The French public were still somewhat skeptical of paper money, especially with everything that happened with John Law. And so they essentially said that we're going to burn the assignats after they are turned in at auction. And so if they can commit to a future shrinking of the money supply, then they can keep inflation expectations under control. Now, initially, it does appear that this cancellation program anchored inflation expectations. Inflation remained more or less pretty mild until July of 1794. However, after the death of Robespierre, and for the following basically 2 years, approximately 2 years, prices ended up increasing by more than 11,000%. Now, here we have some evidence from Saint-Just, who is actually saying it looks like the hyperinflation maybe even have started in 1793. He says the enormous creation of assignats that we have made have their source mainly in the acquisition of numeraire. The more assignats we created, the more the relative value of the currency increases, and the more the currency increases, the more assignats must be created. So the idea here is that the government is printing money to purchase to cover its outlays, but every time it prints money, it's requiring additional money to purchase additional outlays, which requires printing more money. And if we look at this period, 1794 to 1796, which is what we focus on primarily, and the reason we focus on this area primarily is that in Sargent and Veld's paper, they really argue that the standard model, Kagan's model of hyperinflation, really only applies to the period 1794 to 1796, and that the earlier periods were characterized by what they call the real bills doctrine and then the legal restrictions theory. So we see here on the red line, this is going to be inflation. Now, one thing I want to point out is the scale on the graph here. So inflation, the scale is on the right-hand side of the graph, and this is per 10 days. So the revolutionary week is every 10 days. Our data is prices of gold every 10 days. And so we see that by early 1795, right around this point right here, we cross into the territory that Kagan describes as hyperinflation, which is when inflation crosses a threshold of greater than 50% per month. So this is the weekly equivalent of 50% per month. And we see that once it crosses this threshold, it jumps up quite a bit, comes back down, jumps up, it stays higher, and then eventually falls off as the assignats lifespan comes to an end. Also, what we have here are the quantity of real balances. This follows a very similar trend to what we see in other cases of hyperinflation. The scale here is on the left-hand side, and so we see just a general decrease in the quantity of real assignat held by the public as time progresses. Okay, excuse me. Oh, that's a duplicate slide, so we'll move on here. So in 1795, the French government establishes a new regime. The Directory is established in November 1795, but the establishment of this regime was somewhat uncertain. There had been multiple coup attempts that threw the stability of this regime into question. But ultimately, once the new regime went into place, it did weaken the influence of the Jacobins, who favored keeping the assignats in place and propping up their value. But ultimately, this new regime did limit the government's ability to collect seigniorage revenue because it established rules over the appropriation of public funds, which is one of the issues that had led to the hyperinflation in the first place. So what we're going to argue later on is that the establishment of the Directory really meant the end of the assignat, and as a result, demand for the assignat collapsed. So we can see here, this is government's reliance on real seigniorage. So this blue line is tracking real seigniorage between 1794 and 1796. We define real seigniorage as just the change in the quantity of assignats over the average price level. So if you're measuring it per year, it would be the average price level over that year. If it's per week, it'd be the average price level per week. And the red line
I'm going to ask sorry, I'm intervening and ask a factual question. Where do the mandat fit in?
So the mandat come in, I believe, right around here. Louis can chime in and correct me if I'm wrong, but they're going to come in here. We are working on a separate paper of looking at the mandat, but yeah, they come in and replace the assignat right around here as the assignat is losing its legal tender status. Louis, is that correct?
Yes. At the very end, maybe like 3 weeks before the end of.
So you've glued the two series together.
What we do in the paper is we do exclude, if I remember correctly, we stop the series when the mandat starts, and in one other, I think we include like the entire series to avoid.
Yeah, so we did, just to confirm with what Louis said, we did not include the mandat in our series here. So this is only looking at seigniorage raised by changes in the quantity of assignat, not the mandat.
Okay, hold on. There seems to be another pointing question by Matteo Salta.
Sure.
And so he's not a panelist. Okay. All right. So I'm going to allow him to talk. Go ahead, Matteo.
Thanks a lot. Just one question about, do you know what the appropriations were about? In the sense that my recollection from my high school is that the big thing was that at the beginning was that the French revolutionary government decided to be faithful to the debt existing instead of annulling it. And this was the biggest part. Was this, or was rather new current fiscal policy, expansionary fiscal policy, that drove the expansion of assignats? Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Matteo. Louis, I'm going to have you address that question.
I'm not sure I exactly understood the point about appropriation. Could you repeat it
Yes, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. My recollection is that the French government had to face a lot of fiscal spending.
Okay, I'm going to cut you off here because I just wanted questions of fact and questions of substance we'll take at the end, okay? So you're first on.
Okay,
Okay,
excellent.
thank you, Matteo.
Thanks a lot.
I'm have to enforce the law.
Thank you for the question, and thank you, Gene. So picking up where we left off here, we do see real seniors start to trail off right before the establishment of the directorial regime, and certainly after, although there is a little blip up here and then it falls off again. So we're going to present also some qualitative evidence that the public viewed the constitutional change as having important effects on the Assignats. So this comes from a French newspaper in 1795. We must believe that the hope of a new constitution would bring consolation in the hearts and would reduce the price of commodities. Whatever the cause, the price of goods, and particularly that of edibles, has increased by almost a third. The circumstance should hasten the debates to which the new plan of constitution will give rise, and above all, determine the government to put a very prompt economy in its finances. Similarly, we get evidence from police reports around the same time. Quote, organic laws occupy people's minds as well as the restoration of finances. And also courage and patience is needed. It is only gradually that the Constitution will be organized, that the price of foodstuffs will decrease and abundance will be reborn with trust. So we look at what the public are thinking and writing at this time. It does appear that they expect the Constitution to have some effect on the behavior of the quantity of the assignats and thereby the price level in France. Now, it appears that the politicians were also concerned about this. So during the Constitutional Convention, politicians are worried that if they don't get inflation under control, there might be another coup, and that this coup would likely result in their deaths. We have one of the politicians writing, quote, "We run the risk of being hooked to the lantern," which is another way of saying that they run the risk of being hung by the mob if they fail to get inflation under control. So we talked a little bit at the beginning about how inflationary finance works. I want to dig into that just a little bit more here to tease out some of the intuition that drives our empirical exercise. So our model of inflationary finance, we're going to have the time horizon be infinite. So the government is going to be using this money over some infinite time period. We'll talk about what happens once there becomes a known end date. We're going to assume that there's a closed economy. This is not a super important assumption, but basically it means that there are no foreign substitutes for money. We're going to assume a state of stationary equilibrium. There are, of course, models of inflationary finance with a growing economy. Milton Friedman famously has one. Government possesses a monopoly over the money supply, so we're going to ignore the banking system as well. And the general intuition that caught of this is that we have a simple demand curve here for real balances, and that if there's no inflation, then $1 of real balances has to provide $1 of liquidity services at the margin. So in this case, the government would earn a return if it has a monopoly on money of the triangles, or excuse me, of the rectangle 0A BC. But since we're concerned with inflationary finance, we might want to ask ourselves, okay, how would they, or at what point would they maximize the revenue from printing money? And for here, what we would say is that they would increase the inflation rate up to the point where the demand for real balances is unit elastic. So now $1 of real balances or $1 of liquidity services costs the initial dollar plus the current capitalized cost of holding that dollar in perpetuity. So that's why we have the pi star over R. And so the value of the government, the present value of the government's monopoly franchise under this arrangement is going to be 0DEF, that rectangle there. And so this is the standard approach that we get in the literature. And so based on this idea, we go out, we try to estimate the demand, for the public's demand for real balances, and then figure out how elastic that demand is with respect to expected inflation. Now, this approach, while valuable, does ignore strategic interactions between the public and the government. And this is where we think the problem comes in of failing to ignore the rules of the game. So if we let that area that we just mentioned, 0DEF, that's going to be the capital value of the government's monopoly franchise when inflation equals the revenue maximizing rate of inflation. The problem is that it's possible for a one-shot payout to actually exceed this area 0DEF. So the government's in a position that once it tells the public that it's going to print at the revenue maximizing rate, that once the public sets their expectations of that, they're in a position to essentially surprise the public and impose a capital loss on the public that depends, of course, on the size of the inflation rate that the government ultimately ends up choosing. So we're going to assume that if that happens, the public is going to respond with a grim trigger strategy. That means if the government tries to fool them once, the public say, never again will I use your money whatsoever. And so what that means is that cooperation between the government and the public, that can only be sustained if and only if the government is sufficiently patient. Now in the paper, we go into this a little bit more detail, but by sufficiently patient in this context, we mean that the government has to either not discount future seniors revenue at all, or might even have a preference for future seniors revenue relative to present. So the trouble, of course, is that this one-shot payout can be quite large relative to the capital value of the government's monopoly franchise. And the reason that it can be quite large is that it's actually possible to push the public off of their demand curves with surprise inflation. And if we want to use the same demand diagram and apply this idea, well, really what this boils down to is something like the following. The government announces that they're going to print at the revenue maximizing rate, which we said is pi star. That occurs at point E on the demand curve. The trouble, of course, is that once the public set their expectations around that rate of inflation, the government is now in a position to inflate even more than what they said they were going to. So for illustrative purposes, I just picked point H here, but the general idea is that once the public form their expectations, the government can then print in excess of those expectations and then can reap an amount of revenue that exceeds what the value of their monopoly franchise is when they're printing at the revenue maximizing rate. And so in this case, the amount of revenue that the government can get from this one-shot payout is 0GHF, which is of course bigger than 0DEF. And so what that means is that if there's no constraints on the government's ability to create nominal balances, then the one-shot payout could approach infinity, which means that any equilibrium where the quantity of real balances is greater than zero is extremely tenuous. However, if we go look at most cases of hyperinflation, including the Assignats, which I showed you earlier, the graph of real balances, even during a rapid inflation in revolutionary France, real balances remain positive. There's several potential reasons for this. Resource limitations. So in the case of the Zimbabwean hyperinflation in the 2000s, they literally ran out of the paper and ink and other materials necessary to print money. Legal tender restrictions. I have a paper with Vincent Geloso looking at French colonial Canada when they used playing card money and the role of legal tender restrictions. They might actually be able to force the public to use the money. In the case of revolutionary France, Louis can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that some people were actually executed for violating the legal tender laws associated with the Assignats. And then, of course, political factors. Josh Ingber and I have a paper looking at seniorage in the Civil War South, and we find something that looks like the political factors were the determinants of whether or not the government was printing to the maximum amount. So the point is that something does create some demand for real balances, but regardless, this equilibrium is going to be pretty tenuous. And what that means is that estimating the demand for money in such a setting is going to be incredibly difficult. And the reason is that it's not exactly clear what it means for expectations to be rational in this context. So if you think about standard models with rational expectations, we typically think of the public as solving the model, but it's going to be very difficult for the public to solve the model if they don't fully understand what, if any, constraints there are on the central bank or the monetary authority and what the monetary authority is up to. Now, if we relax the assumption of an infinite time horizon, or at least an indefinite end date, once there's a known end date, cooperation cannot be sustained at all because it becomes the government's dominant strategy to maximally inflate. And so we think that this also applies to the case of the Assignat, where it became clear that the Assignat was in fact going to become demonetized. So why does this model matter for what we're going to do? Well, we're going to say that the model suggests that we need to first determine whether or not there's a stable relationship between real balances and inflation when we're going to go study inflationary finance. If there's a known end date, we would expect there to be a breakdown of the relationship. We also are going to want some type of estimation technique that requires us to make the minimal assumptions about the public's expectations. We're going to have trouble if we rely either on adaptive or rational expectations in terms of estimating the demand for money. So with that model in mind, I'll now turn to our empirical analysis in the paper. So our data on the quantity of the Assignats comes from Nogaret. These are a weekly series, so it allows us to look by week, not simply by month. We have data on prices. We're going to focus on gold prices specifically. And the argument we make in the paper is that the price of gold is a better measure of the price level than the price of commodities. And the reason for this is pretty straightforward, which is that during periods of hyperinflation, and this was also the case with revolutionary France, the government often imposes price controls on commodities. And so the prices of commodities in countries experiencing hyperinflation may or may not be a very good measure of what is actually going on with the price level. Because the world is largely on some form of the international monetary system at this point in time is some type of a gold standard. The gold is essentially a measure of the exchange rate. And this is something that the French government has much less control over relative to commodity prices. So we're going to use gold as our measure of the price level. Now, again, if we go look at the qualitative evidence, it suggests that the public were doing something similar. So if we look here, we have a police report from 1795. It says, if this is Parisian merchants, sell for Assignats, it is only after having calculated the numeraire, that is gold, they are worth at the stock exchange. So the public were looking at this when they were thinking about accepting Assignats or not. Now, we have this in an appendix in the paper, which is on the website for the seminar. Gold prices are correlated with the prices, strongly correlated with prices of other commodities. So we don't think that there's any trouble with using gold as a measure of the price level. This is a picture of what Nogaret's data looks like, of where we get our estimates of the quantity of Assignats in circulation. And when we put all this together, we end up having 73 observations. We have 73 observations. Now, we split this period up in a couple different ways. So our entire data set runs from May 10th, 1794 to May 10th, 1796, and it gives us a total of 73 observations. When we do our structural break analysis, which I'll explain here in a second, we identify two separate periods within this much larger period. The first period runs from May 10th, 1794 to November 2nd, 1796, and there are 54 observations. The second period starts in November 12th, 1795, and runs through May 10th, 1796, and there we're going to have 19 observations. So we do a test for the structural break. Now, as I mentioned, we have a much larger sample, which is here on the left-hand side of this table. So this is going to be May 10th, 1794 to May 10th, 1796. We see a break in the relationship between real balances and inflation. This break occurs on November 12th, 1795, which, as I've already mentioned, corresponds to the establishment of the directorial regime. Now, we did try a restricted sample as well. So this would be taking Sargent and Veld's approach, where they really focus on the period immediately following the demise of Robespierre and look at starting July 1794 and then ending in March 22nd, 1796. Again, we find a structural break. And not only do we find a structural break, we find that it occurs on the same date. So we ran the numbers in the paper with both sets, but we're going to focus most of our attention on this unrestricted sample here that runs from May 10th, 1794 to May 10th, 1796. So if we plot out inflation and real balances using the structural break to sort of cut the data, what we see here, the blue X's are the relationship between inflation and real balances in the first period. So we see a negative and inverse relationship that we would expect to see. So we can kind of see a demand curve in there. Of course, we'll show more rigorous evidence rather than just ocular least squares here, but you can see that we've got some inverse relationship here. Now, interestingly enough, when we go to the second period, we don't really see much of a relationship whatsoever. And what we're going to argue is that we saw a severe weakening of this relationship between inflation and real balances. Now, it could just be that our structural break is just a figment of the data, but we don't think so. Here we've got the price of perpetual bonds. We can see around this same time that there is a substantial increase in the price of perpetual bonds, implying a fall in their yield, a substantial fall in their yield. So something is happening around this time. Generally, when we think about bond prices going up, that's generally regarded as something as making the government more viewed as more credible. So we think that this is consistent with our findings in the structural break analysis. But there's also some qualitative evidence that we'll report on. So we have one police report that notes, quote, "The project of the convention was to demonetize the assignat of 10,500 pounds, and that people added that several members of parliament did not hesitate to say in their societies that there was no other ways to bring in 7 or 8 billion of assignat on the 15 which are circulating." Likewise, the lower house of the parliament orders a report on how to reform the monetary constitution. This is at the end of October 1795. So this is just under 2 weeks before our structural break. The report is presented to the parliament on November 13th, 1795, one day after our structural break. And a report to the Minister of the Interior on the day of our structural break says we expect a partial demonetization of the assignats. So if you remember back to our model, what we would expect to happen is that once there's a known end date of a particular type of money, that it's no longer in the it's the government's dominant strategy is to maximally inflate, and the public are aware of this. If the public are aware of this, they're going to essentially try to reduce their holdings of the assignat to zero. Finally, a police report on November 15th, so this would be 3 days after our structural break. The public sees the assignats, quote, "annihilation as proximate," so it's incoming. So what we have so far is that the evidence suggests that the new regime, the directorial regime, did affect the demand for money. But to determine how, we're going to need to measure the demand for money on either side of the structural break that we identified. And we're going to use a Kagan-style money demand function. So this is going to be our specification. On the left-hand side, we have the quantity of real balances at time t. So the lowercase variables m and p are just the natural log of the money supply and the price level, respectively. And then we're going to regress that onto expected inflation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. Expected inflation. And then we have a constant term. So in this literature, it's very common to assume that real variables like the real interest rate and real output are constant during periods of hyperinflation. Now, of course, that's not literally true. Kagan's justification for this is that movements in real variables like real interest rates and real output.
I'm going to tell you have 4 minutes left.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right. Well, then let's get to it. Okay. So the primary variable of interest here with our specification is alpha. Alpha is the semi-elasticity of money demand with respect to expected inflation. And once we have an estimate of alpha, we can actually estimate the revenue maximizing rate of inflation. This is going to occur where unit elasticity is going to occur with this specification where expected inflation is equal to 1 over alpha. And it's also going to permit us to determine the effect of regime change. So our argument is that alpha is not or may not be independent of the rules of the game. Our estimation technique has several advantages. We don't have to make any restrictive assumptions about the public's expectations. If the growth rate of real balances is stationary, if the growth rate of inflation is stationary, and if real balances and inflation are co-integrated, then we can estimate the demand for money using OLS. So here we've got our augmented Dickey-Fuller tests. It does indicate that both series are stationary. We have a test for co-integration. So here's our first period. We do have evidence of co-integration. Our second period, again, we've got evidence of co-integration. And interestingly enough, when we look at the total period, we've got evidence of co-integration. So when we do our OLS, well, we end up getting our estimates of alpha that are right here in bold. So for the first period, we find that the seniorage maximizing rate of inflation was 19.5%. After the establishment of the directorial regime, Alpha gets very close to zero. The seniors maximizing rate of inflation increases to almost 200%, which seems implausibly large. But given the large point we're trying to make in this paper is that if we were to just look at the entire period rather than accounting for the effect of regime change, that we would get a biased estimate of what the seniorage maximizing rate of inflation would be. Because if we look at the entire period, we find that the seniorage maximizing rate of inflation is just under 36%, rather than decomposing the entire period into two. Again, we've got a second series, the more restricted sample over here. Of course, the estimates are slightly different, but everything moves in the same direction. This is just summarizing what I've already said. So if we look here at actual and seniors maximizing inflation, the blue series here is actual inflation over this time period. The red dashed line is what we estimate the seniors maximizing rate of inflation to be. We find that the French government was operating below that point for a good part of the Assignat hyperinflation, although of course that changes as 1795 progresses. The black dashed line here is the 35%. That would be if we didn't decompose this into two different periods. And so to wrap up, we think this illustrates that monetary institutions matter. And if we're going to study hyperinflation, we need to incorporate the rules of the game into our analysis. If you fail to do so, you're going to end up with biased estimates of the demand for money, which is what we found in our paper. And this is going to lead to misleading estimates of revenue maximizing inflation. Of course, more cases need to be considered. We should revisit other examples that have already been analyzed in the past of hyperinflation. And for better or for worse, I think for worse, there's always new cases of hyperinflation coming along. And so we should apply this insight to new episodes. And really kind of to wrap this up, hyperinflation is often accompanied by political instability. In our view, political instability is caused by weak institutions. Weak institutions make regime change more likely. Thus, hyperinflation is a terrific, provides a terrific setting to study the effects of the rules of the game. And with that, thank you so much for listening to the presentation, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
I guess I'm in charge of delivering the comments to you, so I'll try and summarize them. First, well, Matteo had a question, which I take to be about the debt, perhaps. I'm not quite sure. You asked him to repeat it, so if I can find him, I will try and get this to work. We'll see.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll try to clarify the question. The question is the following. And relates about the relation between the government and the people who get the fiscal advantages. Okay, my recollection of France of this period is that the debt and the assignats exploded at the beginning because the government decided to pay existing debt to clergies and to rich and aristocrats. And so I want to understand whether this is true first, and if it is not true, why they think that the institution, whether they think that the institutions that determine hyperinflation are not also related to political, to giving fiscal advantages to the political part that supports the government, which supposedly at the time should not have been the clergy and the aristocrats.
Okay.
This,
all right.
Louis, go ahead, Louis.
Yeah, I can try to answer this. Thank you for the question. I think it relates to one other question in the chat, which I think your interpretation of the French Revolution is quite right. You could interpret like the French Revolution at first as a sort of coup by the bondholders of the state that they wanted to get their money back. And so one way of doing this was to expropriate the assets of the clergy. Now, the problem is that those assets were quite illiquid. So what they did is said like, look, we're going to have those assignats and we are going to use them in auctions when we sell church property, and then they are going to be burnt. And that was done basically until the end. But yes, I think your question is probably similar to one that was about why didn't they raise taxes? And I mean, Eugene White has a very good paper in GEH for like the macroeconomics of the French Revolution, which is that there was a sort of war of attrition between different interest groups. During the French Revolution, and it became extremely complicated to to raise taxes because you wanted to get rid of the ancien regime's tax system. And at the same time, people were opposing the new tax regimes that they had to put in place to have a sound fiscal policy. So I hope that answers the question.
I'm going to try and summarize some of the remaining 4 questions. There's George Perendi who said, why didn't they just tax higher? And the answer, I think, to that is that the tax machinery for collecting taxes completely fell apart and for a long time. So it was always impossible to do that. But I have a number of questions here. And that is, I think one of the things which troubles me a little bit, the historian part of me, is that the model treats everything as though you have perfectly well-functioning.
Did it cut?
It did,
unfortunately. Yeah, not perfectly well working Wi-Fi. So while Eugene's Wi-Fi is playing turns, maybe we can take some of the other questions.
Right.
So one of the early ones is by Clement Jobst. So you argued why we should use gold price in Assignats, but yes, whether there were no restrictions on the selling and buying of gold.
I can answer this. There was at some point, and then there wasn't. So they went back and forth. We don't seem to see an effect of those legislations on like the demand for money directly. And most probably this is because it was fairly difficult to enforce laws outlawing the buying and selling of gold. Now, the Treasury, they had their preferred merchants and bankers, and they would use them to buy and sell gold. So like you would have quite famous Protestant bankers, Perregaux, for instance, who would go abroad, buy the gold, and then sell it to the French government.
Okay. There's a couple of questions from Guillaume Dodin. So I'm going to let Guillaume ask them himself.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm very naive about hyperinflation models, so I'm trying to wrap my head around what you are doing. And my first question is that I'm trying to understand what was the initial regime before the Assignats came in. And I think you said that the old regime had a reliance on inflation, and I don't understand what you mean, because the currency was pretty stable after 1726. So I'm sure there is something I don't understand. So I would love it to be clarified. And the other thing is about the numéraire, because I have the feeling the numéraire was actually silver, not gold, and France was under bimetallist system. So what was the situation? Would it change anything to your story if it were actually the case?
I'll chime in just for a couple thoughts, and then I'll have Louis as well. If I said that, I misspoke about the inflationary aspects of the regime prior to the Assignats. What I intended to say was that the experience with the John Law's first system made the public skeptical of paper money. But as far as when the Assignat hyperinflation really takes off, if we don't have the slide in the presentation, but this is not until later on, like we said, in 1794. In the years immediately before 1794, prices are in fact pretty stable. In part, we think because the collateral for the notes was viewed as being credible. And so, Louis, I'll kick it over to you.
Right. So with respect to the regime, given our sample, the first part of the sample is mostly after the fall of Robespierre. So it's like the Thermidorian period, whereas, like the fall of Robespierre is a sort of like internal coup within the Jacobins club. And then there are questions about whether you keep the current regime or you are moving to another constitution. And it ends up being that those favoring a new constitution and the directorial regime end up winning. So yes, about silver, I think that's a great question. I think there is data on silver prices, but I don't think they are as comprehensive as for the ones we use.
Okay, so it's a question of data rather than you thinking that the numeraire had changed.
Look, I mean, inflation during that period is actually quite high. So I wouldn't expect like the changes in relative prices between gold and silver to play that much of a role compared to inflation with respect to the assignats.
Thank you. Now, there's a more technical question from Kim Osterling, and this is also something I wanted to ask. So you use these break tests. But of course, the break tests come with a confidence interval, and sometimes it's pretty wide. I've done this myself. So the question is, how wide is the confidence interval for the break date? Namely, because you compare explicitly with the previous work by Sargent and Velde. And my question on that line is whether you tested a model, or whether you considered not imposing a break test, but actually allowing for multiple possible breaks, and what you would get if you did it. What did you get in that case? Thank you.
So I can address a couple of those, and then I can ask Josh to chime in if he can on the confidence intervals. We did do when we did our structural break test, we actually found 2 breaks. We find one in the summer of 1795, but since our primary interest was wanting to just establish that there was that changes in regimes can have an effect on the demand for money, we neglected that we talked about it in the paper, but I didn't include it in the presentation. So we do actually find 2 breaks in the series, although if my recollection is that the strength of the first break in the summer of 1795, the evidence for that is not quite as strong as the evidence for the break in November 1795. Louis or Josh, do you have anything to add on that?
Well, just 2 things on that. We conducted multiple tests on the confidence interval. Initially we just used the option package in Stata, which I believe has it at the 95th percentile, but when it's the standard option. But we moved it up to 99, and it did not change any of our results. And then with regard to how we handled multiple breaks, we're using the Supremum Wald test, which does not impose a break date at all. It kind of looks for one. And once we had that break statistically tested, we would then cut the sample and use the same test to see if there were other breaks. And in the end, we realized that this paper wasn't about how many breaks there were, just about showing that if there's evidence of at least one, we know that there's some bias across the whole period. So we thought about we could go down a rabbit hole with multiple breaks. We do see some evidence that there's a second one as well. That slide that Brian showed with the different relationship, what he called the ocular least squares approach, does correspond with there possibly being 3 demand curves. But again, what would happen is we had so little data to begin with that when you start to break it up into 3 periods, you lose the ability to have any statistical power.
If I may just say one more thing about the second break we found, which is it actually matched approximately what was called the Journée of Prairial, which was like a sort of a Montagnard attempted coup. For like 2 days, there was quite a bit of uncertainty over whether or not the Jacobins would be able to seize back power. And it was almost successful. In fact, they invaded the parliament, cut the head of one of the parliamentarian and presented it to the chief of the assembly. So it was a pretty brutal.
Yeah.
I believe that Napoleon put that down with a little cannon fire near one of the churches where there's a plaque.
Right.
I'm back. I like Napoleon. I'm back after being cut off by the internet. I guess being sent to Elba or something. I'm sorry that I was supposed to be guiding this, and I missed. I can hear that you've gone past the questions I had, which were about multiple breaks and about the fact that there are all kinds of other controls being imposed, which are something of a concern, I think. Controls of markets. all kinds of laws against speculation, you name it. But I do and the fact there were other monies. There were the caisse patriotique, because the Assignats were only issued in large denominations to begin with. The mandat afterwards, and I think, the question is really, is this the right technology for answering the question? And finally, how does the change in the maximum revenue change our understanding of the revolution?
I can answer the caisse patriotique. I've read your papers at the beginning of graduate school, but I do think that at this time they were outlawed at the time of the sample we have. In fact, later during the directories, there will be a quite big debate over whether or not banks of issues could be created because they had been outlawed by the Jacobins during the terror.
So isn't this the question, though? Your data is what, 2 years? How long?
About 2 years, I think. That's
Cut the data so that it fits the theory. I'm being difficult, I know.
Well, okay, like the reason why we used that data is because it's weekly and it's just only, like we use all of Nogare's data as he gave it to us. If he had given us more, we would have looked for like a wider time period. But
you have my paper actually cited where I go through every source and match them up as carefully as possible. So, yes. But I think it's a problem because it's a regime which is struggling to, the question is, are they actually engaged in some game with the public, or are they struggling and trying every device possible to squeeze out on every margin money for the regime?
I think that's an interesting question. I need to give it a little bit more thought as to whether or not it's really just we're grasping at straws to get as much revenue as we can from any source that we possibly can. I guess my initial reaction to that would be, we're still trying to figure out, well, how would the public respond? Like, how would that affect their demand for this one instrument that the government is using to raise revenue? How would they respond to not only this sort of grasping at different ways to raise revenue, but once it becomes evident that the Assignats are going to be demonetized, how would the public respond to that sort of event? But I need to give your question some more thought.
This is the price of gold in Paris, in Assignats, not in elsewhere.
Absolutely.
Okay. So let me see if there are some more questions. They look like there may be another question.
Give a word also on like the regime struggling, which is, yes, they were struggling, but there were also problems with like the political organization of the National Assembly before the directorial regime, which had aggravated the fiscal situation, especially appropriation by committees that were competing with each other and did not take care of the overall health of public spending. So you had a sort of like externality associated with the organization of committees during the most radical.
So let me ask you a question about this. In that, do historians traditionally see the initial establishment of the directory as a break? Because that's a pre-economic history. That's a question.
I mean, it's a new regime, like with different rules, with different system of public finance that they try to impose, even though it's like extremely difficult. They did take care of, within the new constitution, trying to lay out the rules of like, the relationship between the parliament and the treasury much more clearly, so that like they don't have some of the problems that occurred beforehand.
And the public had confidence in the initial announcement. That's what I'm saying. Because
they seem to, because the price of bonds rose, at least initially, quite substantially. Now,
so the bankruptcy of 2/3 is 1797.
Yes. So like
that's outside the sample.
Yeah.
And that's a significant break. Yeah.
So if you look even at like intellectuals, like Benjamin Constant, as like his letters at the time, And he is extremely confident that the new regime will be able to restore confidence and healthy public finances. Whether or not that panned out in the longer run, well, maybe not. And one reason is then the Directory had some political problem of its own. They faced political competition from both the Jacobins and the monarchists, and they went into a more and more semi-authoritarian direction, where like you had a series of coups by the directors that made most of the constitutional provision almost void in the longer.
So we have 1 more minute to end the formal session. So you guys should sum up something. Take the last minute.
So I think thank you so much for the questions, both to everyone who asked them, but then also to Jean. I do think that we need to think a little bit more about your point about whether it is just sort of grasping at whatever they can get, rather than this sort of like, well, we have a model in mind. Are we trying to get as much revenue out of this as we can? And I think we also take your point about whether or not historians, not economic historians, but historians view the establishment of the Directory as a major significant event. But to your last point about, okay, we have this event that occurs in 1797, I don't see our paper as trying to make a claim about the goodness or the badness of the Directory, but instead we're trying to look at the episode of the Assignats that are considered to be hyperinflationary, which is this period from 1794 to 1796. And so I noticed there's one question in the Q&A, and I can kind of address this at the same time from Josh Picker. Josh asked about what are the policy implications. I don't know so much that it's a policy implication as much as it is going to study episodes of hyperinflation. We need to think about the stability of the regime in which the hyperinflation is taking place. I think that's what we see as one of the takeaways from our paper. So that would be my final remarks before we end the formal part of the discussion. Louis or Josh, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Just to thank everybody again. This has been enlightening. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
We're now going to have 15 or 20 minutes of informal discussion. I think it's just a free-for-all. So I think people are the remaining 72 class is dismissed if you want, or you can hang around and chat. So I do have one little item, is that they were very concerned about managing public's expectations, because at some point they declared that paper deliveries to the factory manufacturing the Assignats would be secret. And there are high penalties for revealing any information about the deliveries of paper. So they knew the public was watching very carefully.
Well, and later on, and we were sort of surprised that we didn't see this, in 1796, they have the public display of burning of the printing, the destruction of the printing presses and all the materials. We were actually sort of surprised that we didn't see more of we were sort of expecting to see a break there when we did that analysis. But
I remember correctly, they stored up some Assignats to fool the public and spend.
Yeah. Which I think, if you remember on one of the charts that we had, you see that seigniorage falls, and then there's one last jump up, and then it falls off from there.
Yes, in fact, so the police reports that we use as a sort of like corroborative evidence in the paper, you had this sort of like police with like a network of agents was in Paris to like survey what were the feelings of like inhabitants in Paris to avoid a revolution or a major popular uprising. And so they gave detailed reports also about their feelings related to the Assignats. And I think we include one in the paper where they say like, yes, they are going to destroy the printing press, but we know that this is nonsense. They are actually trying to screw us doing this.
So apparently Mike wants to ask a question, but I don't see where. I'll see if we can find him in the participants pile here. Yes, Mike, go ahead if you want to talk.
Okay, I'm not an expert in this field, but I really want to know what's the big takeaway that comes out of this. This seems to me like a footnote. Okay, so I want to know the question I always ask, but I really want to know, what is it? Is this going to change how we understand the economics of the financing of the French Revolution?
So I'll chime in on what I think the takeaway from the paper is more generally, and I'll let Louis, if he would like, talk about the French Revolution. As a GMU grad, I was very influenced by the work of Jim Buchanan, and in particular his book, The Power to Tax. And one of the big takeaways that I got out of that book was that the idea of studying inflationary finance the way that it's commonly done ignores these rules that govern the creation of money. And so the idea that we're trying to illustrate with the paper, not specifically about the French Revolution, although there are aspects there too, yet one of the ideas that we're trying to illustrate with the paper is that in a sense, the seigniorage maximizing rate of inflation is not necessarily time consistent unless there's some rules that force the central bank or force the monetary authorities to actually produce that amount of money. And so when we go study episodes of hyperinflation and fail to account for whatever rules there are that are governing the creation of money, we end up getting, or we could end up getting, misleading estimates of what the seigniorage maximizing rate of inflation is. It didn't happen to be, in this case, it didn't happen to be, but there is a well-known empirical anomaly called Kagan's paradox that it looks like governments seem to print far in excess of the seigniorage maximizing rate of inflation. Well, that could be because, okay, policymakers are irrational or whatever. It also could just be that because we're failing to account for the effects of regime, we're getting estimates of the demand for money that result that give us misleading estimates of the seigniorage maximizing rate of inflation.
That was a finding in the
takeaway.
1970s about regime shifts and hyperinflations, I think. There's a whole literature on that. There is what, I think, for instance, you say Kagan's, 50% is the breakpoint for hyperinflations. That's purely arbitrary.
Agreed.
And so, you might want, I think you have to be careful about about the theory telling you more than the history a little bit. But because he was very careful in his original paper not to be too dogmatic. And yet people took him in that way and then produced papers that said we have these paradoxes when he would not have said so. Right, Mike?
Yep.
I think also maybe one lesson is that ending an hyperinflation is extremely, extremely hard. And I mean, we know this, but in that case, maybe the new regime trying to end the hyperinflation and go back to sound money, in fact, exacerbated the depreciation of the assignats, because then the public was like, look, they are probably going to demonetize that paper money. And that's when you see the highest level of inflation during the.
So Pamphili Antipa had a question, which was about war. And shouldn't you take that into account more importantly? And I would add civil war as well, because that's really cutting into your tax base and everything else.
So in the paper, what we do is like we include an appendix with like the main events at the time, both war, political and otherwise. And in 1795, the military situation stabilizes substantially. Peace with Spain is signed, peace with Prussia is signed. I mean, most of the revolts are crushed or at least under control. There was one attempted invasion of France in Quiberon by the royalist forces and the British.
It drowned.
It failed miserably. So war is not as much of an issue as it would have been, let's say, 2 years ago, two years before.
So I'm going to take Pamphili's point and say maybe it's the battlefield victories which is determining the regime shift, rather than.
We looked at like the battles. I actually have like a big book with all of the battles during the period, and I just screened through all of them and see if there was anyone matching even remotely with our identified structural break. And there wasn't. So
the other thing is that the British were actively counterfeiting assignats, and that's always been a worry in the numbers, and quite successfully. even though they tried to stop it. I remember reading some paper about this, thinking that estimates of somewhere accounting for somewhere between 10 and 20% of total stock.
Yeah, I don't have as much of a good answer to this because what has been confiscated, we don't have data for. And I mean, it's not a good answer, but.
I'm just saying that one has to be careful in presenting the material not to omit those things, because then it looks like you're fitting the data to the model. And that's not what we want to do. But it's tough. Actually, this is the reason why I didn't do what you've done long ago, which is most of the technology was there, because every period seemed to be a shift. And it was very difficult to actually carry out some sort of a size without chopping up the data in different ways, which felt kind of miserable. But it's tough either way. There's another chat, I think, new one. Let's see if that is. Anyone else have a question? We still have 55 participants.
I'll unmute myself and ask a question, if you don't mind. I mean, one thing missing from your paper is I couldn't find any figure. I mean, just of the nominal quantity of assignats in circulation. So everything is deflated in real balances, and then we're subject to all these concerns about the deflator. I would think that when you're presenting this stuff, you start with a nominal thing before you start deflating things and using deflators that are, I mean, people, as you've seen, have all kinds of doubts about whether using gold or silver or something else, but it would be interesting to see the money creation process. Is it something smooth? Is it something choppy? And so if say in the period before the directorate it's relatively smooth, or afterward it becomes very volatile, the printing of the assignats, the money supply itself, the nominal. So these are things that are kind of missing from the graphs that are in your paper you presented, and we give an idea of the process of what they're actually doing, as opposed to what's the outcome after you've deflated it, and sort of the ex post developments.
We definitely have that, and it's a good suggestion. We'll definitely get that into the paper.
I don't see anything else unless Rui does any other chats, but if that's the case, thank you very much. Very good presentation. And
thank you very much for having us.
Yes, thank you. It's great. So hope to see you all in person at some point.
And before that, next week.
Yes.
Yeah.
Next week is the last event, and we will tell us about it.
For a presentation by Doug Irwin on the economic consequences of the repeal of the Corn Laws. It will be the last seminar in this series, but we'll look forward to see you next semester after the summer, re-energized for a new series of the international microhistory on my side. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.